As we've seen, the actual fighting of the revolution began on an April morning in 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence was given.
And so, as you know, as reading in April morning suggests, these battles occurred when a British force left Boston and marched down the road to Lexington and Concord, where they ran into militia on the way out, and they ran into forced engagement at Concord and then decided to come back, and that was a bloody disaster for the Redcoats. And they were, of course, trying to capture Sam Adams, John Hancock, the leaders of this incipient rebellion, and stashes of rifles and ammunition. Well, shortly after the battles, the colonial army surrounded Boston and began placing the big guns, artillery, cannon, on the hills around the city, aimed down into the city and into the harbor. The British knew they had to remove those cannon or they had to evacuate the city. It's untenable. Life is going to be short if they stay there. Meanwhile, Congress decided that someone ought to be placed in charge of this army, and we're using the term loosely now, that surrounds Boston. 43-year-old George Washington, who was a member of this Congress from Virginia, he wanted this military command. He showed up at congressional meetings in his old 7 Years' War uniform, as if they had forgotten, right? I have experience. I'm available. I'm still relatively young. Northerners realized that a Southern commander, again, Virginia, a Southern state, a Southern commander of this army in Boston would unify the various colonies, North and South, behind the cause. And so both North and South united behind Washington, and he became commander of this colonial army in June of 1775. Again, it's still over a year before independence. When Washington learned of the bloody battles at Lexington and Concord, he wrote a friend. A brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast. Now it appears that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves. Slaves to Great Britain. Back in Boston, the British moved to expel the Americans from the heights, from those guns around the city. The Battle of Breed's Hill, of Bunker's Hill, results, in which the British commander, who despised the Americans and their fighting ability, decided to teach these Americans a lesson, and so he ordered a frontal assault, charged straight up the hill with bayonets, and pushed those rabble colonists off the hill. A frontal charge into muskets and cannon. That is the definition of arrogance. And if the Americans had not run out of ammunition, they never would have taken those hills. But they did. And the British did take those hills. Nevertheless, the casualties were enormous for the British. The British commander realized he had paid a dear price for this victory. He remarked, another such victory would have ruined us. Now, Washington arrived near Boston in July of 1775, well after these battles. And he could not believe the state, the condition of this army. Legend has it that when he realized the rabble that he had become commander of, he sat down speechless for a half an hour. What have I done? But amazingly, within a year, the British are forced to leave Boston. They get back in their ships, they evacuate the city, and the colonials take Boston back. Hooray, the war is over! Some hoped. But it wasn't. This is a long war. This is a bloody war. It's just begun. And so the British did not sail back to England. They sailed down to New York. And they invaded Staten Island, New York City. This is General William Howe and his British Army invades New York City and Staten Island and then pushes the American army off the island and back across the Hudson River and back into New Jersey. And then they follow the American army into New Jersey and they keep pushing it back across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Defeat after defeat after defeat for Washington and the colonials. Now it's winter, 1776. Morale in the colonies is at a low. It appears as if the revolution is lost. Men are deserting the army. Men will not join the army. Supplies are hard to find. Nobody wants to contribute time or money. Washington realizes something must be done, even though it's the middle of winter, in order to revive the cause for independence. And so now he plans a surprise attack that begins in the middle of the night. His army recrosses the Delaware River back into New Jersey to surprise the British at a little town on the riverbank called Trenton. And this is the famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. The painting is a complete farce, of course, because the crossing is done at night. And if I were to show you a picture of the actual crossing, it would be dark, and you wouldn't see anything. A blank, dark picture. Because Washington doesn't want the British sentries to see a light glimmering in the boats a few miles north of their camp. So everything is dark. And he's not standing in the bow of the boat, because if it hits an iceberg, where's he going? Into the drink. But what the painting captures, though, which is entirely accurate, is the spirit. And so it's historically accurate in that sense, if not in reality. It catches the spirit. Washington crosses the Delaware, and they march several miles downstream. They surprise the British on Christmas Day at Trenton. The British, of course, are not actually British soldiers. They're German soldiers who have hired out to the British Army. It's Christmas Day. They're Germans, and they're drunk. That made things a little easier. Victory. It's not a huge victory. It's 1,000 German soldiers, but it's a victory. But what next? General Howe's British army is not very far away, a few miles. Vastly outnumbers Washington's army. Surely Howe will realize what has happened and march to Trenton and capture Washington now, whose back is up against the river. How do you get out of there? If Washington just tries to recross the river, he's probably going to get caught right in the middle of the crossing by Howe's artillery, destroyed. And so Washington now decides to become even more bold. Instead of trying to get back across the river, he decides to go the other way, farther east. Not exactly into Howe, but towards a little town called Princeton. There's just a small British detachment there. This is not something that Howe would have expected. Washington again abandons the camp around Trenton in the middle of the night. And then Howe was surprised to learn that the old fox, Washington, was not there the next morning. Washington had left the campfires burning while the soldiers scurried away. Now Washington approaches Princeton. His army is all spread out on the road. And he decides to split his force. He decides to send the majority of his soldiers off to the right and around to the back of Princeton to come in the back door, while he will take a smaller portion of them right down the road and into the front door and catch the British soldiers in a trap of ice. Great plan. But the first thing generals learn when they study war is that as soon as the first shot is fired, the plans go out the window. That's usually the case. In fact, that's a good lesson for all kinds of endeavors. You got your plan, but then as soon as whatever begins, you find that, my plan wasn't exactly realistic. How many of you had a plan coming for Fox and you've already realized that your plan is not as great as you thought it was? Does that happen to you? Okay. Not working out quite the way you planned? Yeah. That's the way life is. Good to know that. You should have a plan, and then you have to be able to adjust to reality. That's what football coaches do, right? They go in with a game plan, and then after the first quarter, they start to make adjustments. At halftime, they make a lot of adjustments, and usually whether they're behind or ahead, it doesn't really matter. They adjust to what the opponent is doing. Life is just like that. And those who adjust best are the most successful. Plain and simple. So Washington now has to adjust. Washington had sent his Virginia regulars, regular soldiers, professional soldiers, okay? They were in the vanguard, the front of his line, and he had sent his Virginia soldiers down the road, over the hill, and then they were to go into Princeton. And then as they were disappearing over the hill and down the road, Washington began to hear gunfire coming from that direction, but he couldn't see what was going on because of the hill. And as that gunfire grew more and more ominous, Washington realized that something had gone wrong. And what had gone wrong was that the British had received orders to march towards Trenton. So they were coming out of Princeton, coming out down the road, and they ran right into Washington's Virginians. And they vastly outnumbered the Virginians. And so now the Virginians are being pushed back. Washington realizes he's got to send reinforcements to the Virginians, but all he has right there on the road with him is militia. So Virginians and other groups of Continental soldiers are professionals, but this army is also made up of a lot of militia. Militia, these are the men who come out on the green once a month and they march and they practice and they drink and they have a good time and they do some practice shooting and so forth. That's militia. Those are the guys that were on Lexington Green that April morning, okay? They're not regular soldiers. And Washington will tell you, if he were here, that you could not expect much from militia. If you could get militia to fire 3 volleys, that was all you could hope for. And sometimes you could just hope for 1. Because militia don't plan on dying that day, okay? Or making a stand. But what else does he have? It's only militia standing there with him on the road to back up the Virginians. And so Washington orders the militia to go up over the hill and down the road and support the Virginians. And they do. They go up there. They're scared, of course. But when they come over the hill and they look down into the valley, they see the Virginians are falling back. And these professional soldiers are falling back, but they're not running. They continue to stop and turn and fire every once in a while. They're falling back in good order. But the militia don't recognize this. All they see is their brothers coming back the wrong way. And so they panic. They think they're being routed, and they don't want to stand there and take that. By this time, Washington himself has ridden his horse up onto the top of the hill, and now the militia are running in his direction. And so Washington now takes off his hat and raises his sword, and he's riding his great white horse back and forth, and he says to these militia, "Parade with me, my brave fellows!" It's an odd choice of words, don't you think? Parade with me, my brave. It was brilliant. What do these guys do once a month? They get out on the green and they parade, don't they? They march up and down. And then he reminds them they're brave. Parade with me, my brave fellows. They are but few, he yells, and we will have them directly. And now the officers begin to shout at the militia, "Line up on the general! Form on the general!" That is to line up on his horse. Right? And they're grabbing men and they're throwing them into line. And now the men are starting to recover their sense, their composure. And they're getting a little ashamed of themselves. And so they start to form up on Washington as their officers demonstrate where to go and what to do. And now the Virginians are beginning to fall back into this line. And now if you're militia, you got a Virginian standing right in front of you. And that feels really good. Because he's going to take the first bullet, isn't he? And now Washington has another brigade of professional soldiers coming up the road from behind. And then within a minute or two, you've got a soldier standing behind you and you can't run. You got a militia sandwich. And now Washington gives the order. March! And they all just stepped off as if they were one soldier, one soul. They got to within 30 yards from about here, just past the back of the room there. And Washington then shouts, "Halt!" And they all come to a clattering stop. And the British are just beginning to come out of the smoke and the fog. And Washington says, "Aim!" And the muskets come up and down, and the entire line, 3 men deep, aims. And then Washington says, "Fire!" And his officers yell, "Fire!" down the line, and all the muskets went off at once. And there's a moan and a groan from the British. They had not expected that. But the British are professional soldiers. And now, in spite of their dead, they form their lines, and their officers give the same orders. And there's a volley coming from the British. And there's moaning and groaning from the Americans. And the man left of you, or perhaps right of you, falls. But you've been reloading the whole time. You've had something to do, right? You're ready to fire again. And so the two sides traded volley after volley after volley, and you couldn't see anything because of the smoke now. And surely Washington, riding his horse above this whole thing, is going to be killed up there. And his officers were sure that he had been, but again, nobody can see anything. And then, off in the distance, it appeared. The British soldiers running out of the smoke, off into the distance, off into the green, and away. And Washington sees this, and he realizes he has the day. And so now he can't resist. Charge! And everybody goes down the hill in a mad charge. So what has happened at Trenton and Princeton? Again, small battles, but enormously important these few days in the winter of 1776. The significance of the battles. The American people are re-energized. News of the victory goes up and down the colonies. The revolution would go on. But this is not the end of the dark times. This is just a moment of light. The winter of our discontent. Less than a year later, the good news of Trenton and Princeton were countered with defeat at Germantown in Pennsylvania. And this was a larger battle. And with the defeat in Pennsylvania, Germantown, and a few other battles, Congress feels like they have to run from Philadelphia. And so Philadelphia is abandoned and taken by the British, the capital city. And now Washington's army retreats north of Philadelphia to a place called Valley Forge. And I don't know about you when you were in grade school, but when I was in grade school so many years ago, we heard all about Valley Forge and how tough it was. Starvation, disease, cold, snow. This is a test of the virtue of these men, just to survive the winter at Valley Forge. But there was some good news that kept the flame of hope alive. First, a separate American army. Not all the armies in the colonies are under the direct command of Washington. He is the overall commander, but other generals with other armies in other places exist. and a separate American army under a general by the name of Benedict Arnold forced a large British army at a place called Saratoga to surrender. This is a great victory, and this is a large battle, taking thousands of British prisoners and supplies that were desperately needed by the colonials. And so the victory at Saratoga is huge to help keep the revolution going. And secondly, Benjamin Franklin, who in the early days of the revolution was sent to Paris, to France, to negotiate the help of the French in our war with the English, Franklin's diplomacy is successful. The French finally decide that, yes, we will help you Americans. Now, why were the French interested in fighting the British? That's it, exactly. This is a monarchy. This is a king. They have no interest in Republican ideology, democracy, or the common people. And in a few years, the French are going to go through their own revolution that is modeled on, at least in the beginning, the American Revolution. Okay? And the king is eventually going to lose his head. But not yet. Lucky for the Americans, not yet. And so that's exactly right. The French want to come in to take the British down to get revenge for their defeat in the 7 Years' War. It's the French who want to be the great preeminent power in the world, and that's where Great Britain is. And so the French want to take them down. And here's an opportunity to use the Americans as part of this process. And that's why. Usually when Americans remember the revolution, they think, well, a bunch of farmers defeated the greatest navy and the greatest army in the world. No, no, no. That is not true. We have allies. And we have our professional soldiers. And our bunch of farmers, although they helped, they're militia. And if all we had was militia, as I like to say, we'd still be speaking English. Even with French aid, even with French money, French guns, French soldiers, the French Navy especially, the war did not turn immediately in our favor. In May, the British decided to take the war to the south, and so they invaded Charleston, South Carolina. And they took Charleston. And a large American army there was captured. And at that point, in 1780, the war seemed lost again. Most of the time, the war seems lost. Then another British victory came at Camden later that year of 1780. And emboldened by that victory, and I don't want you to memorize every one of these victories here in the South. It's not going to be on the test that way, okay? But I'm telling you the story. But emboldened by their victories at Camden, the British continued to march inland and beat the American forces at various battles in the South. Finally, American General Dan Morgan found Cornwallis, and Cornwallis is the British commander of the British Army in the South. He found Cornwallis at Cowpens in January 1781. And those of you who are fans of the American movie with Mel Gibson, The Patriot, this recreates to some extent the Battle of Cowpens. And Morgan manages to maul the British Army pretty substantially there at Cowpens. But again, they fought at Guilford Courthouse, and although this is a bloody battle, the British countered it a victory. But now you see they've been campaigning in the interior of the South. They need to be resupplied and reinforced. So they have to go back to the coast, where the British Navy then, the most powerful navy in the world, will bring them reinforcements and supplies. And then the war will continue if Cornwallis has his way. So Cornwallis marches to the Atlantic coast, and then he marches north to a place called Yorktown, Virginia, where he is waiting there on the coast the resupply of the British Navy that has been promised. But as far as the British are concerned, this all looks great. Another resupply, another reinforcement, and perhaps the war is over. But now is when our allies show up, just at the right moment. The French fleet, reinforced throughout the world by the Spanish fleet, who was their ally, the French move to cut off Cornwallis from the British fleet that is coming down with those supplies and reinforcements from New York. So what's going to take place is a great fleet engagement off the Atlantic coast of Virginia. And whoever wins this engagement is perhaps going to win the war. The French fleet versus the British fleet. 9 times out of 10, who wins? British, greatest navy in the world, ship for ship, sailor for sailor, captain for captain, better than the French. But this time, the French brought more ships, more guns. And if they handle their ships well, they can win. And Admiral de Grasse, the French admiral in charge of this fleet, handles his ships well. And this time, the French Navy turns back the British Navy. Now, the French Navy puts the cork in the bottle, so to speak. Cornwallis is surrounded on water by the French, and now the colonial armies and the French army are coming up to surround him at Yorktown. And so the Battle of the Virginia Capes in September of 1781 turned the war toward the Allies, towards the United States. As I suggested, shortly after that victory, Washington's army was moved. It was up north still. His army is put on French ships and brought to Yorktown. And now surrounded at Yorktown, Cornwallis agrees to talk peace. Had it not been for the French and the Spanish and the loans from the Dutch money, the United States could not have been victorious in this war. This is a world war, and the United States is just a pawn at this point in this war. So once again, allies had proved decisive in an American war. So we've studied 3 wars in this class since we began, 3 major wars, and in every single one of them, allies have been instrumental in the victory. King Philip's 7 Years' War, and now the Revolution. It's a theme. It's a theme in American history, the use of allies. It's not embarrassing. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. That you have friends in the world that share your values. The peace. There's always a treaty to end a war, so you look for the treaty, and that's going to give you the results, right? What are the results of the war? Tired of the war in North America, and very worried about the French, Spanish, and Dutch in Europe. So the war in Europe is going on, folks. And the British have decided, you know what, we cannot afford to waste our resources in North America. We've got to get out of that conflict, and we've got to focus on the war here closer to home. So that's why they're willing to cut their losses and let the Americans go. Again, it's all about the Allies. It's all about the World War and the proper strategy. And so in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and there are many treaties of Paris, so I'm sorry, you got to have the date here to know which one we're talking about. Paris, oftentimes the capital of diplomacy in the world at this time. The Treaty of 1783 then is the Treaty of Paris is the one that ends the American Revolution. It would have been easier if they had called it the Treaty of New York or the Treaty of Philadelphia or the Treaty of Washington, D.C., but it couldn't be the latter because there is no Washington, D.C. yet. Okay? But it's not. It's the Treaty of Paris. And now that I've rambled on about that, hopefully you'll all be able to remember it. So, what was the most important thing that the Americans should get? The most important result? What is it? You know, okay, there you go, independence. You're not wrong when you say land, the land that they have now that's independent, right? But independence for the colonies. Okay, good. Number 1, independence. Number 2, what exactly is independent? How much land does this include? And the answer is everything out to the what? Out west to what? Mississippi River. That's substantially more than the original colonies, right? Yeah, okay, bargain. So that's point 2. You got to know where the boundaries are. You can see on the map, Mississippi River. Number 3, you got those British soldiers out there in the old Northwest. Where's the old Northwest? Well, you live in the new Northwest, okay? The old Northwest is that part of the country, Ohio, Illinois, et cetera, et cetera. There's a great university there in the old Northwest called Northwestern. Don't you think they should change their name? Gosh, talk about arrogance, right? So, just so you know, the Northwest, right? Well, in the Northwest, we were concerned that the British from Canada up there would not exactly leave those forts at those tiny little places like Detroit. Does that ring a bell, Detroit? Is that American? You bet. So 3 was withdrawal of British troops from their forts on the northwest frontier. Number 4, limited navigation rights for the United States on the Mississippi River. So as far as the British were concerned, we can navigate the Mississippi. There is a problem, however, though. Who controls New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi? The Spaniards do. Okay, so the British are kind of going, this isn't really too much. The world is a complicated place. And 5, and this is crucial, fishing rights off Newfoundland. Some of the greatest fishing, Atlantic fishing in the world, some of the greatest fishing in the world is in the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. They're in the North Atlantic. And a lot of those New England fishermen, that's where they went to fish. Now, if you don't have this in the treaty, those fishermen can be kept off those fishing grounds by 1 or 2 British war vessels, okay? And they could ruin our fishing industry and much of the economy of New England. And while that's economic history and it's not exactly fascinating for most of us, it's crucial. We're going to have enough economic troubles as it is. So point 5, we get to keep fishing off Newfoundland. The most important result of the war, beyond independence, was that the ideas of equality and freedom would be given a new breath in the world, an opportunity to develop. Our country began with the idea, the new idea, that all white men were equal in political and judicial rights. But that was just the beginning. The story of America, the story that I have told you from the beginning that is the best way to understand our past, is to understand that this process of change goes on. This is what Benjamin Rush, the other day in that quote I gave you from Benjamin Rush, was alluding to. The Revolutionary War ended at a certain time in 1781. But the American Revolution, the idea of revolution, the idea of rights, continues on to this day. And our history is the history of how more and more people, more and more groups are added to the rights of equality and freedom. And an expansion of what equality and freedom mean. It begins here, but it is not finished here. Summary. In the American Revolution, the world had seen something new, something bold. A people had redefined their relationship to government, claiming that they controlled the government does not control them. Moreover, limited freedom had produced a prosperous society. So prosperous that the thought of losing it propelled many, both North and South, both high-born and low-born, elites and commoners, to take up arms in order to preserve their newfound positions in society. They risked their lives to preserve what they had and then to gain more. Of the 25,000 Americans who died in the Revolution, Not many of them owned plantations. Not many of them were prosperous merchants like John Hancock. Not many were born to privilege like George Washington. But most of them, and most of those who survived the war, those who came to call themselves Americans, believed in their inherent God-given equality with any other white male human being. And that was new. Some of them found the basis of that belief, of that ideology, in the Enlightenment philosophy that I told you about the other day. And some of them found the basis of that belief in their Protestant Christianity. And the vast majority of them combined both those ideologies together to give them a bulwark in this faith, in their own worth. Regardless of its origin, it was an incredible development for one generation to deliver to the next. Eventually, it not only transforms the United States, because we're not done growing, changing, it transforms the world. Questions? Yes? This is a great question. Why was General Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown seen as the end of the war? And the answer is, it isn't in London. There is an argument in London. It's just one army. It's just 5,000 men, right? And so the British can send another army over or 3 more armies over, and the war can go on. So why did the British give up at this point? And the answer is, those who believed that they should focus on the rest of the world, on the war in Europe, won the argument. And so the decision is to let the American colonists go. Okay? Great question.
So then how much longer did that war last outside of
The World War goes on for some time. Okay? But ultimately, the French, who are waging this as a naval war in various places, including India, decide that they're going to come to the conference table as well, and so the Treaty of Paris is hammered out. Yes?
Were the natives in this war that they were just kind of pushed past the Mississippi so they could help?
No. You still have Native Americans in that area of the Mississippi and Ohio, and some of those people will have peaceful relationships with the colonists, but a lot of them will form an alliance themselves and launch an attack on the colonists who move out there. Okay, which results in more wars. Okay, Pontiac's rebellion and so forth. Okay, these are all good questions. Hold it just for a minute, please, here now. Hold it. Okay, so what are the questions? Yes, go ahead.
During the war, does George Washington, did he ever actually fight, shoot a gun, or was it just giving command?
Officers did not generally fire weapons at that time. Okay, yeah. But Washington risked his life on numerous occasions. The battle at Princeton is just one of them. Everybody looking at that thought that he should have been killed, right? But he wasn't. Obviously, he wasn't. Okay, so what are important questions from this lecture?
Significance of the war.
Okay, significance of the war. That should be relatively easy for the American Revolution, right? Okay, yes?
What were the goals of the war?
Okay, what are the goals of the war? What's the number one goal of the war? Independence. Okay, yeah. It's like I said earlier, you don't want to overthink that, right? Okay, what else? Important people. Washington is so obvious, right? So Washington is one of those Americans who is so obviously important that you have to know more than one thing about Washington. There's the bad news, right? You got to know a lot about Washington to be able to get the identification questions and such right. But who else is significant in this lecture? Cornwallis, somebody said. Okay, fair enough. He is. Yes? Absolutely. Benjamin Franklin is the diplomat who gets the French alliance. And by the way, if I can use an anachronism, Ben Franklin in Paris is a rock star. He's very popular, especially with the French ladies. I have no idea why. So, yes, he wins the alliance, which makes the victory possible. Okay? He and Washington, right together. Who else? Or what else? Okay, Battle of Saratoga, right? Historians argue about this, whether Saratoga was so significant or not. I think it's pretty significant. Okay. Yes, what are the results of the battles of Trenton and Princeton? Anybody?
Raise morale.
Yeah, absolutely, raised morale. The American people thought the war was lost, and now, Washington wins a couple of significant victories, if not huge victories, right? We're not dead after all. Okay? You can imagine the American people thinking, well, the war is lost. If we give up 15 or 20 of our leaders, Washington, Adams, Hancock, et cetera, they'll be hanged, of course. But the rest of us will go on with our lives, the way things were. Okay. Sound good? Yeah, people thinking that way. All right. Well, God bless you all. I'll see you on the next class.